All right, we can get started. The next panel is called Debiasing Academic Research. I'm John Barrios. We were originally scheduled to have 4 discussants. Nick can't join us this morning, so we're left with 3 great panelists to discuss this notion of the role that academics play in providing information for policymakers and the current threat with which independence has been judged. Even the conversation earlier today kind of alludes to what exactly do we gain from like true ideal academic research. I was brought in last minute, otherwise I would have thought this panel should have been titled, self-reflection. It's only fitting that at the Stigler Center and the man who set up regulatory capture, we kind of follow up with economic capture, a nice term that Luigi has very eloquently put. And as an accountant that likes to think about antitrust, I do a lot of self-reflection, so it's nice that rather than look down the ivory tower, we actually look in the mirror sometime and think about how our research is impacted by our incentives. And with that, we have 3 great panelists. They're going to give a couple of introductory remarks, and we want to kind of set this up more of a discussion. To my left, I have Tommaso Valletti. He is a professor of economics and currently serves as the head of the Department of Economics and Public Policy at Imperial College. He's a non-executive director to the Board of Financial Conduct Authority. He was chief competition economist for the European Commission between 2016 and 2019, and he led the economic analysis on many large mergers, including Microsoft, Google, Android, and he's published extensively in the fields of I/O, regulation, and competition economics. To his left, we have Anat Ahmadi, who is a George Parker Professor of Finance and Economics at Stanford Graduate School of Business, a director of the Corporations and Society Initiative, while she is extensively published on information financial markets, financial contracting, and corporate governance, including banking. Her current research and teaching, as well as advocacy, focuses on complex interactions between business, law, policy, with a focus on governance and accountability. And finally, we have Christian Lloyd, who will begin the panel. He is the Joseph Sonder Professor of International Economics, Finance, and Accounting at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. He is an editor for the Journal of Accounting Research. He is also a research associate at NBER and CEPRS. Professor Lloyd has written extensively on the role of disclosure and transparency in capital markets and other settings, the economic effects of regulation, international accounting, corporate governance, as well as corporate finance. His current research focuses on issues relating to reporting and ESG issues. And with that, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, John, and thanks to the organizers for asking me to be on this very interesting and prestigious panel. I thought to kick us off with a little bit of evidence, but before I go there, I wanted to sort of first flag that there's different forms or sources of bias. There is the bias that presumably we're going to talk about mostly on this panel, which is the idea that there's outside or industry influence on the results. But there's also publication bias, so this idea that there's too many significant results in the literature and that null results are difficult to publish. There could be directional mistakes. The authors start with a hypothesis, they get initial results that kind of look like what they were expecting, and then they don't search as carefully for maybe coding or data issues than if they get unexpected results. And then there's also what Gelman calls the garden of forking paths, which recognizes that there's lots of flexibility in research, and then when we get to a fork, we make decisions. And if we make these decisions contingent on what the data is, we could end up with biased results, even subconsciously. And that whole sort of recognition and the evidence we have, for instance, on publication bias in various fields, psychology, social sciences, political science, and also in the biomedical research, have led to this discussion over reproducibility of our results, the reliability of our results. And I think these are important debates to have in the background of today's panel. And I also mentioned these other sources of bias because they're also present when we're going to look for bias that comes from industry sponsorship, right? So when we're trying to do this empirically. So what do we know about bias in academic research? And here I want to focus on medical research because that's an area where there's obvious strong commercial interests and incentives. There's a lot of industry funding and sponsorship. And it's also an area where people have long recognized this issue. It's clearly why this is an important issue in the medical research. And it's where we have a lot of studies. And so there's 3 studies that I want to mention because they have done a lot of work in this area. There is a meta study of about 37 studies that just looked at this issue of industry sponsorship and research outcomes. And the evidence suggests that industry funding would, or authors with industry funding or studies would report more favorable results in terms of the effectiveness of the drugs. There is also a Cochrane review. These are systematic reviews that follow certain guidelines, and I'll talk some more about that later because I think it's very relevant to the panel, where they aggregate 75 different studies on the question of industry sponsorship and research outcome. And they find that industry-sponsored studies more often have favorable efficacy results, similar harm results, and more favorable conclusions. The other result that's in that review that's really interesting is that the industry-sponsored studies tend to have a bigger sort of a disconnect or less agreement between the results and the conclusions. So suggesting that where some of the bias might be happening is in the conclusions that people draw from the evidence. And then there is another study that I'm mentioning because I think it might be relevant for some of the things I'll say later, is the Hansen et al. Study, which basically looks at bias in reviews. So in these systematic reviews, in these Cochrane reviews that aggregate the literature, they look at about 1,000 of these reviews that are on all kinds of medical questions, and they basically find that estimated treatment effects were not statistically significant or different for reviews that had industry conflicts or financial conflicts versus ones that didn't. There's also no statistical significance difference in the frequency of favorable results with and without conflicts of interest. But they do find that systematic reviews with financial conflicts are more often having favorable conclusions and somewhat lower methodological quality. So again, pointing to maybe where some of this is happening is in the interpretation of the results. Now, to be sure, there are some results in the literature that also say there's no association, but overall, I would judge the evidence as saying there is support for this idea that industry sponsorship connects with more favorable outcomes. But what's important to note is that we don't know, or we know a lot less about the mechanisms. So is this implicit bias because people get more favorable towards the sponsor once they interact? Is it publication bias? Is it the company controlling the data? Is it suppression of adverse results? There's a lot less. The Lund review, which is the second review that I mentioned, explicitly states that their results cannot be, of industry bias, cannot be explained by standard methodological factors that may increase the risk of bias. They're basically saying the source of bias is unclear, right? So with that, let me just briefly mention something about, and talk a little bit about the mechanisms to counter bias. One thing to counter bias would be simply to not engage with industry, have no funding, no consulting, no advisory, and so on. And that's been discussed quite a bit in the medical literature as well. But it's clear that there's going to be trade-offs, right? There could be that financial ties with the industry could have benefits too, in the sense that there could be learning, there are innovation arguments. Half of medical research is funded by industry. There's 6 times as many private clinical trials than there is government trials. And maybe one other anecdote that's really interesting, the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet had said, we're going to ban conflicted authors for reviews, for these survey articles where you aggregate the literature. They had to relax that policy because they had trouble finding enough qualified authors without conflicts. The FDA had a similar policy for advisory committees, and again, they reversed that policy. So there is the trade-off. So where did the medical literature and some other literatures landed is disclosure, right? So the idea is in the articles, people disclose the ties that they have so the audience can judge and adjust their interpretations of the research findings. That's pretty standard now in most of the top medical journals. Many other journals have followed suit in other areas. There is a debate over compliance. So in medicine, they're now discussing, should we maybe have a public registry, given that we also have an open payment database? But a more fundamental question is, like, do they work? And here I want to just tell you one more study, and then I quit. The do they work question, meaning the conflicts of interest disclosures, you can think about those in 2 ways. First, you want to know, do people actually respond to these conflicts of interest and adjust their assessments of the research findings? And then you could ask the question, given that, would that change the behavior of the researchers, right? So those are two, I think, things that we'd have to research. On the first one, we've taken a stab at this problem with some co-authors, where we basically had the following idea. We said, why don't we look how other researchers respond and react to conflict of interest disclosures by looking at their citations, right? So if the idea is that there is some evidence, as I was saying, that research with industry sponsorship is biased, if people respond to this, one way in which researchers respond would be by citing that work or citing it less. And so the idea is, do people discount? Can we tell from citations and we have some other things that we look at, but is there evidence of discounting? If you think 5 minutes about this problem, or maybe even less, 30 seconds, it will be obvious to you that the people who have conflicts potentially are very different from the people that don't have conflicts, and there's lots of reasons for why research with conflicts could be cited more versus research that doesn't have conflicts. And so it's a thorny selection problem. We do a couple of things, and I don't have the time to go into, but there's two results I want to highlight for you. One is when we look at reviews and we try to control for a bunch of stuff, the reviews, again, that's where there's more discretion for the authors to maybe shade sort of the interpretations. There is less citations of reviews when they have conflicts. And we also find that when there's sort of a revelation, a new revelation of a conflict, prior work of the same author that was sort of published previously gets cited less once that conflict is revealed. So that suggests there is some form of discounting. Now, is there enough discounting? Does it work? Does it change the behavior? We don't know that. But I think it is interesting evidence. There are some other things that I think we can talk about later, like code sharing, data sharing that might bring transparency. There's one other that I want to set up, and then I'll hand it over, I think we should also talk about pre-registration and pre-acceptance of articles, which is another tool that people have used to counter some bias, and also talk a little bit about why is it, or what can we do that the market for ideas and studies works better, because in principle, the market could be a solution here to this problem too. So with that, let me hand it over.
Thank you, Christian. Our next speaker, Tommaso, is going to take it over.
Thank you, and thank you to Filippo and Luigi for organizing yet again a fantastic conference and for having me on this panel. So I will talk about economics in particular, but first I want to say that this problem of publication bias is well known. It's actually a field of research in its own. There is even one of my favorite terms, which is called agnotology. And agnotology is, in sociology, is actually it's a study of how ignorance is deliberately produced by corporate funding of research. So agnos in ancient Greek is not knowing, so we don't know enough. And so there's a whole history in the tobacco industry, in the mining industry, in the sugar industry, you mentioned medical research, pharma, medical equipment, so there is a lot there, and you have fantastic case studies to learn about. The tobacco industry, famously, when they launched this academic research program, they said, doubt is our product, okay? We want to sell doubt, okay? Because that's what you need in policy. In policy, where there are huge rents and you're trying to move the dial, if you say we don't know enough, it means you're not gonna go anywhere, okay? You're not gonna go anywhere because you're not gonna affect anybody. And this is the first message important for the academics in the room. I don't know in accounting, but economics, every other paper, probably every paper finishes by saying more research is needed. Okay, we all finish like that. All of us. I mean, there is perhaps because we want to be cited, which is our own incentives. But if you do that in policy, that's a death sentence. So because someone is going to read that line, more research is needed. We don't know enough, and then it stops. It stops the entire conversation. So let me get into economics and also why economics is actually dangerous when it comes to competition policy. We are trained to think about counterexamples. Economics is about, on the one hand, on the other hand, any decent economist can come up with a counterexample. We'd go to our senior common rooms to a conversation to find the funny result no one had ever thought about, which is great for our conversation, perhaps for publication, but is that what you need for policy? Policy is not about certainty of a result. If you are 70% certain, 80%, that's great. I mean, by all means, go ahead. And instead, economics can be used and abused precisely to create these doubts, this uncertainty about some potentially big problems in our society. Economics has some differences too. contrary to our fields, and we are well paid, we have to say that, compared to our academic field, so we don't have that conflict of interest. We don't need big infrastructure compared to medicine, compared to engineering, so we need less corporate funding in that respect, with one exception, more and more in development economics. The production function has been changed and you need an infrastructure, but then your interlocutor are governments, so they're not necessarily firms. The two other exceptions in economics are where big rents exist. So this is also surprising to me. We study incentives, we study conflict of interest, we study all of that, but then we don't apply to ourselves, okay? As if we are immune, we are idealistic persona that we aren't. We are subject to incentives, of course, like anyone else. And when there are rents, money is going to be spent where the rents are. And the two big areas in economics are obviously banking and finance, and Anat is going to talk about it, and competition policy. So talking about numbers, when I was the chief economist of the EU, I was dealing with a merger between Bayer and Monsanto, and that was in excess of $100 billion. So that was the money on the table. Running cases against Google, that's a business model that makes $250 billion every year. That's the money, $1 billion. So these companies are ready to pay whatever it takes to get the merger go through, etc. What about the economists? Actually, when you think about competition economics, the gatekeepers are not the economists, but are the big law firms. So Google, Bayer, Monsanto, they go to a big law firm. And they say, we want to get this deal through, or we've been accused of that, help us. And then the big law firms go and hire the economists. But the economists come as a second step. And here we're talking about economics. We have to distinguish. By and large, the dance is being led by the consultants and by think tanks. I don't want to open the Pandora's box unless you want me in the Q&As. There is a whole system of think tanks, of semi-research. They call themselves research centers. They call themselves professors. They don't do any publications in our academic standards, but they are constantly present in front of the judges. They even train the judges. There is a very close and dangerous proximity between those centers, and they don't disclose funding, which is typically coming from the Koch brothers, from Google, from Amazon. So you name it. They come from the usual suspects. So these are the big chunk. And what about the academics? Here I beg to differ from Nancy. I don't know if she's here. Academics are largely absent. I will qualify, of course, but are largely absent, especially the junior people are absent because they respond to different incentives. They have to publish papers for the tenure process that implies in industrial organization writing using certain methods and certain techniques which are just not coherent with the time of policy. In IO, it takes 5 years to write a paper and bring it to a publication. That's the and this is not compatible with. Okay. Of course, we can tell ourselves, but we have devised a method and we can apply it. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Again, the examples that she gave are true, but they are counterexamples. They are the exceptions. They are not the rule. So most of us actually don't deal with, we want to motivate, we tell ourselves we motivate our research by some policy examples, but we have never been involved in a case. We don't know how a case is actually run. So we need a story just to put it in the introduction somehow. Then there is a chunk of economists that I would say are the naive economists. I used to be one of those who think it's funny to find a counterexample as if I'm talking to my peers and how smart I am, etc. And I changed my mind when I was exposed to the way policy is actually done. And we are typically cheap in the sense that for £20,000 in the UK, you write a report, and the report is saying mergers are great in general, or at least under some circumstances. And there are a few old foxes. The old foxes perform very well in front of the courts. They are repeated clients of the usual, process of if there is a discussion. These guys can command millions because they're very valuable in cases which are worth billions. Okay, so this is what economics are actually doing. Academia, as I said, is typically not represented. Also, Christian said it. There is no way that there is a common view of academics, and that's a problem. And perhaps in the Q&A, I will have some solutions for that. But we don't have collective incentives. We don't have the resources. And the final point, the resources to be present where policy is being discussed, which is the hearings, the roundtables, the endless circles in Brussels when I was at the Commission or in Washington, D.C. Every day there is a panel. Every day there is a panel about something. And this is where even well-intentioned policymakers and enforcers, they hear a narrative that everything is fine, markets work. And in general, I would agree that markets work, but not when we are applying that to markets which are super concentrated, where there are huge economies of scale. That's where there is market power. That's where Economics 101, markets don't work. And that's why we are studying them. That's why they're interesting. So the last point, and I will finish, is about data. That's really, generally speaking, in economics, a trend that we need to publish empirical papers. And here we are data hungry. So we do depend. So if you are lucky as a doctoral student to get hold of an interesting data set from one of the big tech, basically you get a job, okay? Which is worth money. But here we have two problems. One is what Luigi calls the Uber problem. So the Uber problem is a problem where Uber will accept to give you data only subject to you doing research which is positive to them. So, and not surprising, but it is correct research. It's not wrong, but Uber will find there's some research that shows that, I don't know, waiting times go down or something like this. But to say, an example that Luigi likes very much, to see whether drivers of Uber are reckless and they cause more accidents, there is no way that Uber will ever give you the data for that, ever. Similar for Airbnb. So Airbnb will get you to some data, and academics have access to some data sets. So if you say wonderful things about the positive externality, but never about the negative externalities. And then there is the big tech problem, which is the opposite, which I find it very interesting. So big tech in the past 20 years never, by big tech I want to be specific, I'm talking about Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, they never gave any data sets for academics for research in competition policy, okay? Never. You have other tech companies, eBay, I've got Steve here, you've got others, okay? You've got Yelp, etc. But these are not the dominant companies. The dominant companies never gave any data sets, which in practice meant, because that's what we do in academia, if you don't have the data, you're not going to study a question. You're not going to study it. You're going to move somewhere else, okay? So our talent for 20 years have been employed in other directions. If I think about digital platforms, the discussion we're having today, 2022, about digital platform, you ask an economist, well, say digital platform, oh, they connect markets. Market exists where they previously didn't exist. However, because of the winner-take-all kind of dynamics, there is a monopolization problem. That's exactly what we knew already 25 years ago, okay? From the literature on two-sided markets, and we are still there. So that's been a huge success because from us, from academics, but we haven't learned something that we should have learned because the questions which are valuable, which is self-preferencing, etc., the data are there, they exist, but we never managed to get handle of those data, so we don't have an answer to those first-order questions, and that's a problem where as I said, the Uber problem is that you direct research in a certain way. But more interesting, the big tech problem is that you don't allow people to do research in a certain way, which means that our collective attention is diverted onto something else, and we are still left with these two hands, and we juggle with still, as we used to do 20 years ago, but I don't call it a success. I do look into my mirror, and I don't call that a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommaso. But yeah, we will be opening Pandora's box, so don't worry about that. The next up, Anat.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here to this really important discussion. And I also congratulate the organizers for the way this comes about right now. So we had a setup where we heard some of what was going on, and we go to the academics now because they are important. Now, when I wrote a book that was trying to explain things to lay audiences, there was a chapter that ended up being deleted, basically eliminated from the book and now just existing online, the omitted chapter, because it was about some really complicated academic stuff for which you needed to explain credible threats and all kinds of complicated things. And we were told, well, nobody really believes that. That's just nonsense. So we put it out of the room, but the academics are important because they are used and they themselves use and abuse their their set of tools. And that's their set of tools. I'm a theorist, and my coming into this and being on this panel comes out of having been very naive for 25 years until I fell into a certain rabbit hole. The rabbit hole was the rabbit hole of banking, and we heard in last panel that, oh, banking is so heavily regulated that you got wise people in Basel. Well, not so much. Banking is a really unhealthy part of the economy. Banking is where academics are sometimes involved, or people who are academic-like in various central banks and other research places, and they produce some research that is incredibly flawed. And they get away with that because they kind of invoke all kinds of complicated models, and a lot of assumptions are hidden in them. So the thing that that economists do, and there's a data issue, and there are a whole bunch of other threads that I can go to, but I want to emphasize the importance of assumptions and narratives. So we are, I think it was Lucas that said in 1988, what do economists do? And he said, we tell stories. And so the stories are a set of narratives that sometimes would be dressed in Greek symbols or in data tables, but in them are a lot of assumptions. And these assumptions are thrown around with not much regard, and then without the proper reflection, especially when you start an introduction being motivated by the real world because you got to sell that your stuff is important, and then you go into the weeds of the model, and then you come out the other side, sometimes making a policy prescription or saying there's more to do, but the results indicate this and that, some carefully worded words, and then off you go, hope to be cited and get published and get tenure and all this stuff, even inside academia. And that's outside being paid, because we don't, in economics, we don't really need to be paid that much. We're very cheap to get to say all kinds of things. But even when we're in our seminar rooms and our conferences, I have stories upon stories. Just give me a glass of wine at dinner and I'll tell you more about conferences and conversations in rooms and what goes on in the sausage making of some of these stories that we tell. So when I first entered this, and I was still kind of not sure quite what happened to me, that was so surrounded with nonsense, and maybe I need to be institutionalized somehow because maybe I'm missing something. I was told that when a policymaker talks to an academic, they just know what they want to hear. They talk to specific academics and not other academics. About 5-6 years later, when I was trying to wrap up my experiences writing a sort of reflection on the enablers of why basically I couldn't get through with a really simple idea that nobody really gave any counter argument against, but they certainly tried. I encountered people from the industry because I started being almost an anthropologist of culture, of capture, to see how this capture, to see how the policymakers interact with the industry, with few academics in the room, in many cases, and where I met one person who continues, I checked up on him recently, continues to work for one of the big banks, very happy, pandemic worked really well for him, unlike another ex-banker who messed up his life by being a whistleblower. This person did not whistleblow, but he continues to do compliance for a major, too big to fail bank, and that's a huge, huge thing that enables this industry to persist in total bloated recklessness. And he said to me, the academics are the problems. This is an industry person saying the academics are the problems. And later, which of course I also thought, but was interesting coming from him, and later in an exchange, in an email exchange, he said, quoting some academic paper of people who are not captured in the traditional conflict of interest, not paid by the industry, but just writing stories that through some other incentive system, publication, other, get cited and get thought of to be very clever and all this other stuff. With such friends, he said, who needs lobbyists? Now, my response to that was that they do need the lobbyists because the lobbyists are the marketing people. So in this world, persuasion matters, and the lobbyists help you persuade. So you pick and choose the academic stuff you like to put in front of policymakers, and I've seen this so many times. And of course, you go and dismiss research that you don't like. And so that's how, in an area where we're talking about absolutely basic ideas that we teach in every basic course, the nonsense can win, which is incredibly sobering to realize how that can happen. And not only that, but the nonsense keeps winning in our seminar rooms and everywhere. You'd hear the words that connotes all kinds of good things, innovation, credit, liquidity. These are words that really are every seminar around Stanford in particular would use one of those words almost all the time. But innovation in finance is oftentimes, of the variety of, these new rules will change the way I get around them, meaning some regulatory arbitrage. And we have a lot of innovations, including in tech, that have caused a lot of harm to this world. That we don't want to look there. So bottom line is that we have the problem in psychology called willful blindness. We have the problem of saying, being merchants of doubt and saying we don't know, and all kinds of other things that made me go to, read social psychology about moral disengagement, about how people can do these things and sleep well and all this stuff. But it's been very dismaying to see the academics refuse to look, refuse to engage, and just continue to make assumptions all over the place and just move on and never really examine these assumptions, never lift the rocks and see what's under the rock, all this stuff. So I can back this with numerous examples, but that's my bottom line. Bias is pervasive.
Thank you. Before we open it up to question, I had a couple of kind of questions and inquiries to the panel. I kind of Tommaso's discussion kind of thought to me about an old methodology book that kind of justifying theory. I'm going to get in trouble, but it was like, well, part of it is there's just consumption value, which is kind of how I thought of your comment as we get in the seminar rooms and we try to convince ourselves of how clever we are. And when we think about then policy value, and kind of getting into Anat's point here, like this kind of crossover between, well, forget about the bias being that you're bought off by the industry. When you have these friends that are just throwing around models and throwing around empirical papers just to be clever and then being strategically picked out. So how do we kind of, as a profession, look in the mirror and how do we balance those two things, thinking about, again, which ends up being an externality that we don't internalize when we write a paper. It's more about, oh, I'm super clever. I came up with this kind of RDD design, and it fits with a nice little monopsony model, and wow. So how do we kind of think about the policy implications, and should we care as specifically for like a junior academic? And it's open to anybody in the panel.
Sure, I can take one crack at it. I mean, one thing that I didn't know about until I sort of started reading more about this in the medical research area is, and I think we can actually learn something from that in economics and other areas, is they made a really concerted effort to build an infrastructure on how to aggregate academic research. And I'm not saying that things are perfect, but this whole movement towards evidence-based medicine has created some features or institutions that I think are worth considering. So the Cochrane reviews that I mentioned earlier are essentially reviews. There's a guidebook, a handbook that has like 200 and something pages that talks about how research should be aggregated. They will talk about how standards of evidence and like the quality of the evidence gets rated. There's risk of bias factors that they try to evaluate. And the reason I mention this and why this is interesting is it would help with the cherry picking or the market for excuses, right? The problem is, like you were saying, we're producing results and then people are perhaps cherry picking the results that support a certain position. And so one thing that we could do, and it's not going to be a perfect solution because as we just heard, I mean, there are issues in medical research as well, but one where it would help is if you systematically aggregate the evidence, and these Cochrane reviews are actually relatively easy to read. There's a plain English version for the policymakers or for the practitioners and so on. That would help because it would make it harder to say, here is a position, and even though it's a position that's way out there, if you say the bulk of the evidence supports the following, and then you kind of aggregate the evidence and you sort of explain how this is supported, what the quality of that evidence is. To me, that would already be a pretty important step, and we're nowhere close to having anything of that nature in economics or finance or accounting.
Go ahead.
Okay, so just to add to that, so we have to think about our own bottlenecks in our own academic careers, and these are the editors of journals. So we really need to affect the mentality of editors of journals. There are many ways of doing that. One way is an event like this, bringing policymakers telling us what is useful and what isn't. So we're going to have Jonathan Cantor today, Lina Khan tomorrow, and we should ask them, what is the type of economic evidence that would be helpful for your job? And instead, the type of things that we do, does it get to you at all? And I think in most instances it doesn't, which raises the question why it doesn't. So that is going to be helpful. As Christian said, in economics we don't do systematic reviews, perhaps because journals don't like them, okay? But instead, there are methods which are used. I mean, in medicine, for God's sake, it's a very important field. Others smarter than us, and they're using stuff, and there is huge policy questions, so we have to do that. And the last thing, maybe it's minor, but I don't think so. And this is our experience, I guess. We both got burnt by our policy experience, by seeing the realities out there. And I had, probably you had to ask yourself, why am I doing this, okay? What is motivating our lives? Is it some extra money you want to do, or you want to do the right thing? And sometimes we have to ask those questions. And it's, of course, people have jobs, careers, they have to respond to their own communities, which have some norms and conventions. But more than that, I think it's good. There is a movement now, so I think ending with a positive, I think there is so much goodwill, and I think I want to be positive for the future because of the young people in the audience.
So there's a lot of emphasis on data, and again, I'm a theorist, so I will say the following. Sometimes there isn't the data, there aren't the data, and then somehow we then can't speak. Or, I was asked many times, oh, bring me a model, bring me estimates. I'm like, I don't need estimates, I know enough to say what needs to be done from where we are today. And the issue of journals is really important, and we don't have enough. And it's not, again, it's also about theoretical work. We just don't have enough wisdom and judgment going into, our own literatures to really evaluate things honestly, especially in a policy context. And it's really important to do. So we have what? JEP, JEL, Journal of Economic Perspectives. I'm just now aborting a Journal of Economic Literature, partly big essay which would have involved just co-author in the law, a tutorial about how legal systems actually work, which economists just ignore by just assuming it works somehow. But who reads that? The question is, who reads it? Does it have an impact? So the problem is really, if it's a Cochrane review that actually gets read, that gets prominent, then we need more of that, and we need to sort of prioritize that rather than assume that let 1,000 models bloom and let somebody take the snake oil and market it or something. And economists also, academics tend to speak with confidence, and so they, it's the people who are useful in courts, it's the people who are, persuasive in our profession, who sort of, just have a way about them that is just confident, and then all the biases built in. Going to careers, I wrote up for ProMarket my sort of little manifesto for academics, and I hinted in that essay But in the sort of off-the-record keynote to academics, I said, if you're a junior, you got to publish. And you got to play that game, and the people with power are the people in the journals and the gatekeepers in the journals, and that's a problem. To change that is a problem. There's just a way in which it perpetuates itself. If you're tenured, and by now it's like literally the first question I'd ask somebody if I'm not sure. I mean, sometimes I know they're junior or senior. You're tenured? Stop now and think about what it is that we're trying to do here. We're very privileged. We're very, very privileged being academics. We have a lot of freedom. We can choose what we do. We can look out the window and see what's needed, and we should. There are so many things that people are not looking at because it's somehow nobody else looked at them, or there's no data, or whatever. But there's so much stuff we haven't studied. Instead, we climb the next kind of branch of a very, very tall, narrow tree. It's really dismaying to see what people work on and what people don't work on in our profession. And it's just a certain cluelessness that I think is sort of something to try to change.
So something that I kind of see from your comments is part of this is even if we de-bias the estimates in the academic field, a lot of this is a messaging campaign. Back to Tommaso's, if you have these think tanks and you have these people out there like merchants of doubt that could be producing these estimates, what incentives are there in kind of the peer-reviewed academic community for you to go out there and actually be like a public advocate? Because it's not enough just saying that, well, we have a metadata analysis and we see that this estimate is outrageous. How do you persuade the public?
Yeah, so there I want to just say, and I congratulate Stigler Center for having programs for journalists and engaging with journalists, that we cannot, in a democracy, we need to hold power to account. And we cannot say that I think that I view academics as a sort of sophisticated investigative journalists. And that's how I want to view some of what we do. We need to help the media, especially today with the media business model being challenged and investigative reporting having trouble being funded, that we are here to help hold power to account. And if we have everything it takes to do that. We just have to want to do that. That's the problem.
I think the want may be part of it, but I think I want to come back to the data issue and maybe connect this with an area that I have studied more and know a little bit more about, is this idea of like regulatory research, right? Where we study regulation and try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. There, I would say data is a huge issue. I mean, we often don't have the data, but it's interesting in my mind to think about why is this that we don't have the data. I think a lot of times people are worried about that regulation creates extra burdens, screws things up, has unintended consequences, and that would make it even more important to study it. And so in my mind, this whole notion of like evidence-based policy making, we're not anywhere close to what, again, they try to do where the term comes from in medicine. But if we were really wanting to do that, for instance, it would, in my mind, would start with data. It would start, for instance, with saying when we pass laws, there's going to be a process that also collects certain data, makes that data available, and then we do a post-implementation review and we look at that. And I don't know enough about antitrust, but my guess is you could do similar things with mergers, where you do sort of post-merger analyses, but you make data available to, and people will say, well, a lot of the data is proprietary. I think there's now really cool ways in which, we can make data available to academics under, where you can't share it with maybe the public, but you at least allow people to work with the data. And it should be clear that the results are not going to be subject to approval. What is subject to approval is that people don't release, proprietary data. And you could also tap companies to provide data. You could randomize this even and say, if you're worried about regulatory cost, 250 companies each year are going to be tapped to provide certain data that we can study certain things, and maybe we'll learn something, and that allows us also sometimes to ease the regulatory burden or to adjust the regulation in ways that would make more sense. So to me, data is really critical. And I'm pretty sure that many of the economists, finance, and accounting scholars would jump at the opportunity of analyzing that data.
On this, just think, there are many concentrated industries where we can do some economic analysis. Think about telecommunications. Why can we do research on telecommunications? Because the FCC has the power to require some data to be disclosed, or Ofcom, which is the regulator in the UK, or equivalent in other countries. Why can we do research on airlines? Because the Department of Transport requires companies to give certain data. Why we cannot do empirical research on the dominant firms in the digital sphere? Because there is no such regulation yet. But there is a big opportunity. So I don't think it's going to come out of the free will of these companies, because obviously they are protecting their own, again, incentives. The incentives are clear on their side. So there are two opportunities. In Europe, is something called the Digital Services Act, which requires the companies which are subject to regulation to give data in a certain way. There is an equivalent bill in the US right now. I don't think people are particularly, or at least academics I know, we're not particularly aware of that, and instead we need to get ready. I read an article in Nature recently saying that these are great initiatives, but if we don't think about APIs, interfaces, how data are going to be collected, this is going to be useless, okay? So it's going to be a big exercise with no, and we need to get geared and prepared now if we want this to be meaningful, because these are regulations which are going to be imposed right now. And again, just to reiterate, we need also perhaps some openness of mentality from our own gatekeepers, the famous editors of journals. Again, I'm in slight disagreement with Nancy earlier. I mean, it's not to pick on you, but just to tell my story. It's true that there is research which has been done on ex-post assessment of mergers. But let's be specific, because otherwise we just look at the exceptions and not at the bigger picture. Those retrospectives do exist. It's John Quokka, it's Orly Aschenfelters and others. And they never managed to get those things in the top 5 journals. Orly, which is a legend in economics, editor of the AER, I don't know from how many years, also there is incumbency in economics, told me at a conference in Stanford 3 years ago, Tommaso, all these retrospectives I did, yes, I enjoyed, etc., but we tried hard to push them into the top 5, and they were never accepted. So they got arraigned, which is good in industrial organization, but it doesn't make the cut to the academic excellence that we do want, because editors, diff in diff, who cares? It's not structural, who cares? It's not the type of work we are promoting in academia. Yes, I can mention one example of a paper on beer which has been published in Econometrics, but again, guys, let's not stick to the exceptions. Let's look at the bigger picture. This type of research, if you had to advise a student right now, I found this cool data of a merger, I'm going to see if prices went up after the merger, you would stop this person, most likely. You would stop this person. And instead, it's super valuable research, because it may be helpful to see whether indeed reintroducing some rebuttable structural presumption is exactly what we need. We have abandoned any structural approach in merger assessment. And if we don't do that research, we will never have the collective evidence which is needed in order to move the law. And we need that.
So I want to say something on data as well as on who we hold accountable. When I say power, I don't just mean in private sector, I mean in government as well. So are we getting the data from the government to show that the government's failing us? Because that's been my problem from the beginning. I'm not mad at the private sector doing what they get away with. I'm mad with government that listens to them, and with academics that don't challenge the government and the private sector on nonsense that they say. So now, so about data and about assumptions. I said twice that I'm a theorist, but actually right now I'm doing empirical work. I'm collecting data manually with a bunch of RAs. Why? Because there is no data. There are no data on very basic issues of law enforcement and corporations. I'm a corporate governance person, and so if you were, the question we're asking goes to the very heart of what we teach in business schools, which is just, is it true that the law protects properly stakeholders just from harms, direct harms even, stakeholders such as employees, customers, public, versus shareholders? Who gets protection? Who gets justice? Basic justice. You need to figure out how what gets prosecuted, what gets civilly settled, what are these agreements? You don't have any data on that. We track street crime data all the time. But if you go for white collar or corporate, nothing. We don't know what happens when corporations harm. Nothing. Even not the abstract harm of spreading risk around the economy, but even more direct harm. I watched very recently the movie about Boeing. People died. People were going to the hearings in the Senate with the pictures of their loved ones. And the CEO, after saying that the airplane was safe, went home with $62 million. Okay, and in banking, obviously, and it wasn't like dead people, it was just a lot of impoverished people who lost their homes. So this huge harm, and now you can talk about Purdue, you can talk about, in any case, collecting that data, we just have anecdotes. You can't go to the journals with that, and that's not a topic we look at. Luigi gave a presidential address about, why don't we look at fraud in finance? Whoa. I mean, that, you can be sure I will never be the president of the American Finance Association because I speak up too much. Which is fine. I came to terms with that. But it's challenging our benefactors, it challenges the view, the business-friendly view that we have. We don't want to question. But even the government, so data, we do need requirements for data. We have too much capacity in all institutions that in a democracy we need to hold accountable what they do, including prosecution discretion and about who to prosecute. We have it on police when we have viral videos, but we don't have it on executive, on why we don't prosecute executives ever, that kind of thing. So, by the way, too big to fail is a big thing, but as I was just given the statistics a few days ago, that 96% of agencies in the US government have explicit policies to consider the corporate's ability to pay in assessing fines. So no wonder crime pays. You have environmental protection fines, which are just cost of doing business completely. The companies make money after fines. That's if they're caught at all. So the calculation is that crime pays in a corporate context, but do we know? We don't have the data. So I do think that we need a lot of data in social media. We need data about the impact of misleading misinformation. And researchers at Stanford have proposed all kinds of views. GDPR could constrain data collection. We need some exemptions for research. And we need to force Facebook and others to give researchers data.
So to build on that, before we go to the public, kind of back to kind of the Uber bias or the private firm data and these kind of implicit biases where you might not share money, but data is power in an empiricist world. How do we set up the incentives or around publication of private data when there are these kind of implicit constraints where I know you get the egregious stuff of Facebook where they sent a stop and desist when they were trying to scrape researchers that had used data from Facebook. So as a profession, like, how does the culture change balancing, this new data to look at auction markets or to look at versus these kind of pro results only coming out of the firms? Thoughts, any?
I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, that it's basically the same issue that we have, identified in experimental work is what people call the file drawer problem, that you only see a subset of the studies, right? And the same is happening with private access to data. Now, I think with government institutions, that regulators that collect data, you could put rules in place where you say, look, you apply with an idea, and there is no, it needs to be reasonable. There needs to maybe an independent sort of advisory board that kind of makes these decisions. And then there is no ex post approval based on the results. The results are what they are. And as long as you don't reveal information that is proprietary, you go ahead. With private companies, that's obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but that is probably a lot harder to achieve. But we could, make that part of the, acts or consider putting more pressure on the companies and saying basically certain data should be made available to researchers and not be subject to approval of the results. And the journals, I think the medical journals do have policies actually when there's, some medical journals will not publish results when the company has control over the data, right? And I think more and more journals could move in that direction and basically say, that would then change also the researchers' incentives. If you said, look, there's certain rules that we have that you can work with private data, but here are the rules. For instance, somebody else might have to be able to come in and say they're going to run the code and make sure that things work, or I think there's sort of ways to address this a little bit through the journals as well.
That was where I was going with this. Is like most of the talk is like external regulation, but as a profession, self-governance, which we claim to, like, is there a coordination problem? Is it just kind of like first mover, which journal would do that because then you'll get a shift? Like, what do you guys see as the constraint on the part of the profession self-regulating?
Well, one thing is, as Christian said, medicine is ahead of us because they have this problem for many years, and the magnitude is also bigger. So they have devised some methods and some ways of dealing with it which are useful. And I've seen, very decent companies giving data, but typically they retain a veto power at the end. The fact that you share drafts is fine. They are industry experts. You want to get feedback. But the veto power is unacceptable. So journals should say, if you want to do it, fine, you're not going to publish in my journal. So this is something that we can adopt, especially in the top journals, and we have. So no strings attached mean no strings attached. Okay, it's as simple as that. The other thing that we don't yet have in our profession, even if we keep mentioning disclosure policy, it's not done enough. It's not done in the right way. It has to be meaningful. Again, I speak just for my own field, but too often I see virtue signaling. If I told you, hey, I've been the chief economist of the European Commission 15 years ago, but in the past 10 years I've been working for Google. So probably you would be more interested if I'm writing a paper right now. I should disclose, who cares about your work with Enforced 15 years ago? You want to know you're working for Google. So you have to name and surname of the companies you've been working for in the past 3 years. This is a policy we adopted, for instance, in the RPM or the CPR on competition policy we currently have. It's fine to do consulting work. I mean, don't get me wrong. I decided not to do it, my choice. But if you want to do it, say name and surname of the companies you've been working on for the past 3 years. Recently, I've seen a paper by somebody saying, oh, this paper, which is ex-post assessment in mergers, one of us was involved with one big tech company for a bit, and that guy was the chief economist of a very large big tech company for the past 2 years and was on the payroll of that company. I mean, you have to be explicit. I mean, otherwise, if you don't change those norms, it's not, we're not going to make any. So disclosure has to be meaningful.
But most journals have moved in that direction. Like we would, for instance, like in the Journal of Accounting Research, if you submit an article, you have to disclose.
The top journals, yes, but there is a middle-ranked journals which are still influential in practice, no. And those rules must apply to editors and to referees. In finance, I hear a lot of horror stories that disclosures are not meant to be asked, and especially when you are people working on controversial areas such as common ownership and BlackRock is financing your department. I heard very bad stories about that. And we need to disclose also, ask referees and editors to referee.
One interjection is a disclosure comment, like it's a signal. And back to my point about having this, somebody talking to the public. So take the case of Jewel, where they bought a full edition of the Journal of Human Behavior. I forget, it's like paid, and you looked at the disclosure. So the editor disclosed that, yes, I am the chief for Jewel. I also wrote 3 of the paper, and it's an internal gender. So all that is publicly there, yet that research was used to peddle the Jewel in front of Congress. So even with the disclosure, there seems to be like a receiver problem in terms of a public imaging. Like, what are we doing to counter that? Like, the limitations to the disclosure, per se.
No, I agree. There are limitations to the disclosures. And by the way, to that, one incident is, I write an op-ed. A bunch of academics write op-eds, and then there is an op-ed by somebody saying the ex-FDIC chair. Well, he was an ex-FDIC chair in the 80s, and he's a chair of a bank, but that's not mentioned. So that's in the op-ed pages. So you can't win in that because there's just many more of them conflicted than you. to your question, disclosure is really important, and very specific disclosure is important. But I actually think that there is a bias in the selection of topic because of the availability of data on certain things, and that we actively must counter that. So we need to basically, there was in the media, the Fair Doctrine Act or something like that, we need to think about, what we see and what we don't see, and look for what we don't see to kind of really look for the answers to certain questions, as opposed to just receive the answers that come from what there is. So there's stuff to be done and people do it, but what's missing? So, for example, myself 20 years ago, when I was more inclined to write theory, I would write maybe a model of, whistleblower rewards. Like, how should you pay bounties to whistleblowers? Okay, that I could see the model in my head. I tried to sell it to some young people. Okay, there's a model. You might get it published. I'm not in the mood anymore to haggle with referees over, a paper that says, this parameter says you should do this, and this parameter says you should do that. Or whatever, which is sort of a theoretical paper, some graphs, some math. We don't look there, even though it's an important question, at how to, what happens to whistleblowers, and how to get, information from within organizations in general. As a problem, there are no data, no models, and maybe the journals don't want it, so people go where the crowd is. We need to try to look where the problems are.
All right, and I think we're going to open it up to the audience. Luigi had his hand up. And then, yeah.
So as Tommaso said, I'm very passionate about the issue of data access as an issue, because we are at the conference on competition. I think that I see a remedy on many of these issues in the competition among academics, but this competition is severely limited by data access. And so clearly one solution is regulation that forces data access, as Tommaso correctly pointed out. One of the benefits of regulation is that researchers can access data and see what's going on, what's not going on, and so on and so forth. However, I would like to discuss, since we have an editor of a journal and a lot of other people involved, is what we can do as academic in journal access, because the only power we have is the journal access, regarding various papers. And I don't have anything against Uber personally. In fact, I use Uber all the time as a consumer. However, I find their data access policy and the interaction of academics particularly egregious. So let me tell you a story, because many people might not be aware. So there is this interesting paper that looks at the gender gap in driver in Uber, okay? This is written by top academics, some of which are my colleagues, and it shows that, surprise, surprise, men get 7% higher pay when they drive Uber. And apparently it's not because of the tips they receive, but it's because they drive faster, okay? Now, the interesting thing is that paper stops there. It's published and stops there. Now, it is an insult to the intelligence of the authors and their good economic training to say they didn't ask the question, wait a second, you drive faster and safely? Or you drive faster and you kill people along the way? Because getting a 7% wage premium if you drive faster, chapeau to you, if this is safe. It's criminal if you actually kill people along the way, okay? Now, why the editor of that journal, The Scepter, did not demand that? And you say, if you cannot answer the question, I imagine, I have no inside information, but I imagine that the answer is, Uber does not allow us to look at it, okay? And you say, but then, if we can only do research on what Uber allows to do, that's not called research, it's called PR. and has its own dignity, but is not to be published in the top 5 journals, okay? So what we should do, and this will have a coalition of editors and referees to say, if you don't have a clear policy that anything that you want to research with the data you have available is fair game, that article should not be published in a top economic journal. And this, as Anat was saying, is not only for the private sector. The first offender of this is actually the Federal Reserve. Okay? The Federal Reserve screens the working papers. People don't know that all the working papers that come from the Fed are screened on content. Okay? And one said, oh, but we rarely do so. And I said, well, that's an insult to the intelligence and economists. We know outside threat, and we know the inequilibrium. Nobody will actually be sanctioned. In fact, I'm surprised that twice they had to exercise the sanction, because it shows that somebody failed the IQ test, okay? But that stuff is extremely, extremely important. And there is a collusion, because we all like the Fed, we all consult with the Fed, we all blah, 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 and so we don't impose this restriction. So I love what this panel is producing, because it's not just belly aching. I think we have the instrument to change, and the first instrument to change is force equality of data access. And by the way, if you read in the fine print of what all our universities require, if you go through the university system, at least in Chicago, but I assume at most universities, and you see what are the conditions imply exactly that. So all the papers that are written and they have restriction, they are academically illegitimate, okay? And as such, they should be sanctioned. They sanction them and sanction the people that do that.
Yeah, there's another question. Luigi exercises director
comment.
He exercises a director prerogative, so please keep him a little shorter. Oh yeah, let's just get all the questions, then we'll do the panel.
Hi, I'm Matt Stoller, and I like hearing the word sanction because it implies some sort of accountability. But I'm not an economist, so I'm looking at this from the outside. And sometimes my reform agenda is to throw all economists into the sea. That's generally what but that does, except weird Italian economists.
They might
right?
swim. They might be able to swim.
So, my experience with economists comes from a couple of areas, but I worked on the Senate Budget Committee, which oversees technically the Congressional Budget Office. And so I used to sit in these meetings where a bunch of the economists who advised how CBO scores legislation, and Congress takes that very seriously, would give advice. And I remember 2 particular examples, these private conversations of economists. And one of them, and I don't remember some of the economists' name, but Justin Wolfers was saying that we have to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the CBO needs to come up with models that convince Congress to pass the TPP, because he said the TPP could cure cancer and bring world peace. Okay? That was his argument. And I brought this up later publicly. I said, you said this, I was there. And he, denied it, but this was a thing. This was true. This is what happened. Another example was these 2 old guys, and I don't remember what their names are, but they started arguing about the problems of trade. They said, what are the downsides of this globalization model? And we agree that there have been losses among some workers. But one of them said, the losses really have been concentrated among the children of the rich, who, because of these trade agreements, have chosen not to work. And the other guy said, oh, that's not true, and they went back and forth. But this was crazy. This was lunatic. And I went up to the head of CBO afterwards. I said, why are these guys in the room? Why do you have these crazy people giving you advice? And she said, oh, that's just so-and-so and so-and-so. And you know them. They are always. And it's like, these are valuable slots making really important political decisions, and they have lunatics actually saying things that are crazy. Another example, Carl Shapiro, in 2009 to 2011, he was the head economist at DOJ. He also did that in the 90s. And he wrote a paper a couple of years ago saying, we wanted to bring Section 2 cases, but there were no monopolies in the economy. We just couldn't find any, right? That's lunacy. That is lunacy. If you read the Competition Bureau report on Google from the FTC in 2012, which the FTC refused to put out, if you actually read their projections, they were saying things in 2012 like No one will ever use mobile phones to search for things. That's crazy. This is not just junk science. Economics is, missed the financial crisis, missed the supply chain crisis, missed the China shock. They need 10 years of data on whether letting predators take over nursing homes kills people, and then says, maybe. This is a profession that is dedicated not just to not understanding, but to pushing cigarettes as a cure for cancer. So I go kind of back and forth, because I know we need a methodology. And for what it's worth, I think Mark Zuckerberg saying, I'm buying Instagram because I want to take competitors off the market, I think that should be enough to reverse that merger. But I kind of wonder, is economics fixable? Is it reformable? Or is the point of economics in all its areas designed to make sure that ordinary people have no say in a democracy over resources? And if that is the case, as I think it is, wouldn't it be better served for reformers within economics to start making the argument that we should pull economics out of every single area of law and find other methodologies to actually enforce the rule of law in a democracy?
Okay. Next question.
Luigi, this is the conference for next year, then.
Yep.
With no economists, though.
Hi, I'm Francine McKenna, and I'm a journalist who's going to become an academic, who's also participated in research, observed research, written about research. So I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I'll spare you all of them. I want to come back to something that Anat said about, quoting someone about, with academics like this, we don't need lobbyists. How do journal editors and tenured professors guide young, ambitious academics to make sure that they're not used? Because I see, in particular in the case of organizations, regulatory agencies, one that's very close to Christian in my heart, where the data is restricted by statute. But yet academics, are hungry for access to that data, hungry to do that research, and you have research that comes out that then may have unintended consequences in terms of people picking off pieces of it, or it's too soon, or it's based on data that's limited, and the academics' research and conclusions is used for policy purposes that maybe they did not realize it could be used for, or that they don't even agree that it could be used for, making the academics more aware of this danger, in particular when they use restricted data or data that has access restricted.
Okay, third journalist you're going to hear from right in a row. Sorry about that. I'm Brooke Fox. I manage ProMarket, which does have a disclosure policy, by the way. Many of you have written for us. But what I wanted to point out, I think there are a lot of parallels between this issue and issues in journalism, which I'm not going to say is free from all bias and capture. But if you are a journalist for a credible institution and there are rules against taking gifts from sources, and you will lose your job. And I understand that tenure prevents that for a lot of academics, but is there not something? But is that not something that academia could learn from, that journals could learn from? It's not only a question of losing your job, but losing your credibility. If you're a journalist for the FT, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and you were to take gifts from somebody and then write a story as a result, like not only would you lose your job, you would lose your reputation.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I'm Michelle Gall from the University of Haifa. Very interesting discussion. And I want to relate to the issue of topic bias and the fact that policy preferences are not given priority because of the current incentive system. And I also think that in the digital world that we were focusing on this morning, we sometimes need what I might call a quick fix with regard to economics. We need the models now, right now. We cannot wait for them. And so you were talking about private funding. You were talking about incentives to publish in journals. I want to suggest another road. And that road is taken in other areas, but it might be taken here. And this is public funding, focusing on areas which are understudied but are really important. In digital markets, for example, clearer models for effects of proposed regulation on dynamic efficiency. Take the top economists, put them in a room, give them very good incentives to do so. It's done in health. It's done in other areas. Maybe we should do it here as well.
Is this working? Okay. So I'm a theorist at U Chicago, and hearing the reporters and your comments, it's a bit disheartening, partly because I'm not such a good swimmer. So I'm kind of like thinking also, we all know that we can do an entire seminar and have a model, and everything is consistent and technically correct, but complete nonsense. And I think there's a bit of a problem also within the university. Why do we have those norms for what functions as a paper that do not select the right things? And of course, I don't have the answers. I want to hear what your thoughts. One reflection from like another field is like the story of deep learning in computer science. So deep learning, those neural nets that are very popular now, was a source of ridicule in the early 2000s. And then in one of the big computer science conference, one of the researchers just put down a model and showed that it works. Like they have data sets and they test how their theories work by just running it. And he blew everybody else out of the water, and within 2 years, everybody switched gears because they saw that the thing works. And can we do anything like this in economics? Like, do our models work? Like, I don't know. How can we change the academic discourse to really ask, does this model work?
Is that it? So I open it up to the panel to...
Yeah, so I mean, we can go on, and we will go on for ages, and there's also lunch. So a few responses. On reputation that journalists have, of course, reputation and losing reputation is a big sanction. But we write in academic terms in a way which is sometimes so vague, precisely because of these two hands. If this parameter is 0.5, if instead Z is below 0.7, so anything can go sometimes. And so, and sometimes we need to think that if I mean, okay, let me step back. I think there is value in research for its own sake, and people should keep doing that without strings attached, independent. As I said, we have good salaries. Let's do it. Even the funny, irrelevant model has its own value. However, if we want to deal with policy, we have to become more assertive, because there's not such thing as something which is 100% sure. Otherwise, it would be per se. Then it's always good, always bad, and the real life is in between. But we need to understand where. Okay, a little bit on average, on balance, looking at the history of industries, looking at I don't know, the work of Dina on the Google was amazing. Just to read how the ad tech industry actually works, it's very valuable. It's very long because the lawyers write in this with lots of footnotes and hundreds of pages. But you learn a lot more than any empirical work that you don't understand the mechanism. You see that on balance something happens, and then more research is needed. And so I don't think we are really losing our reputation, but also because, especially if you are going to be involved in cases, you're very, I mean, if you write something and then you are against what you wrote, then your opponents will bring it out. So this is already orienting your research in a certain way if your plan is to make money. And as I said, there is actually people who make a lot of money with consulting. Not the average person, it's not, but those who are actually into the policy discussion is there. The problem, I think, I mean, I'm very pragmatic, but sometimes it becomes very personal. I'm Italian, obviously, but and we have, I know, why is Italy interesting? Somebody was asking me, why is Italy interesting? Because we saw the problem coming from corruption and much earlier than anyone else. Italy is irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, but when we were growing up, we were under Berlusconi, okay? And we saw what that meant, and we saw the impact it had on markets, on people, etc. And we left, which was also a loss, a personal loss. And then I went to the UK, and in the UK I realized is something called PPE, which is Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Oxford, which creates a whole class of politicians, okay? Which is the real problem of the UK. There, you are trained to argue everything and the opposite of everything within 5 minutes. And these guys can speak in fantastic ways. But then you lose your fundamental values. So this is my philosophy. I become philosophical. I need, not every day. I don't want to go as a psychologist every day, but now and then, just saying, what's my value system? Is my research coherent with my value system? I think this is something which is, I mean, it's part of the conversation that I'm having with myself, with my friends, and with my co-authors. On maths, you like to provoke us, and you know, we like each other, as you know, and you are right in many ways. But is there a conversation where we can have, can economists be helpful, which is what we're trying to do? There is lots of interesting areas and ideas in economics which are coming from not the orthodoxy in industrial organization, the work of Jan, the work of Johanna, the work of Florian, etc., who, some of them even paid their own cost. Florian was not even tenured, didn't get any tenure at Yale University of management, which in my view is a big scandal, and because you're not doing this kind of structural work we want in the profession. But there is positive influx which is happening, and let's get that in. Let's say Thomas Philippon and other people, they're trying to bring ideas, and I think that's what we're trying to do at least. And I think the discussion has changed compared to this very same conference 5 years ago where anything could go. Now you see there's lots of economists which say, well, it's not true. We have observed a lot of facts. There's many elements going in the same direction, and we are trying to change also from inside the system, and there is, you know, change in the institutions which is going in the same direction. But your approach also, Matt, of throwing everybody at sea, it's a nice provocation, but also I would urge you to try to think in what respect. Economics ultimately does give us a framework to think about things, okay, which is very helpful to order our thoughts. Otherwise, it goes. It's not the only one. It's not the only one, and we all agree we are trying to make this much more inclusive, including being here with Christina. We tried on privacy. As I said, other people are bringing in things that, despite what people say, are not the ordinary center of our attention in cases. So I was the European Commission for 3 years. I haven't seen a single case involving labor considerations. So even if we have the methods to do it, we just don't apply them, which I thought it's a lesson which I learned, for instance. But
So in the interest of time, I'm going to give Amat and Christian the rest of the time to kind of respond.
Yeah, so Binya is sitting over here, wrote a book, Economist's Voice. Is that what it's called? Economist's Hour, that's right. About the rise of economics in policy, among other things. And I agree that economists are taking up a lot of space and feeling themselves more important than, or making themselves more important than they probably should be, and less respectful of the real world and other people than they should be. But I wouldn't throw everybody to sea. I mean, I'm an economist, and I feel like, so I don't want to be thrown into sea. I'm fighting the good fight, but, okay. So I'm not taking you literally, but I do, I think you are making a point that we have to look in the mirror. So that was sort of the big theme of this panel as we close it. I also want to echo Luigi about the Federal Reserve in particular, which was really where I cut my teeth into policy. Incredibly protective of itself, and it's incredibly selective on research that they would do and not do, and I have first-hand evidence of all of that going to the papers that come out, the conferences that get sponsored, the people who get in the room and not get in the room, etc. So super problematic. Let's just say, use that word that was used here that I find very liberating to actually talk about the way in which our research and our contributions get corrupted. So it really, the word corruption applies and corruption just means the abuse of the power to write these models and to ho and hum about things and to say and not say certain things. That's a problem. So I think we need to first recognize the problem. So the big problem about academic capture, economist capture, is that people deny it. We're special and different, which is false. Once we recognize it, then we go to where right at home, journal editorials, and what is a paper really about? Does it give us insight, or is it just clever, and that's all? Is it about anything? Can you actually say what it's about, et cetera, et cetera? So there are just judgment questions that are kind of hard to really put your hand on, but beyond conflicts of interest, and you should be able to ask all the questions from data and all this other stuff that certainly is important when it comes to data. But I think there should be certain sensibilities that apply to what we do in our domain, and then the way we engage with the world as well. Sensibilities and sort of a sense of responsibility as well.
Christian?
I guess a couple of quick comments. So first, on the economists that are figuratively thrown into the sea, I would say I've worked more with regulators and standard setters, and I would say often the objections to data access and doing more analysis came from the lawyers rather than from the economists. The second thing I want to say to Brooke's question about sort of the bans for journalists, I think my sense is, but maybe this is thinking as an economist, that there's trade-offs, and the bans, I'm a business school professor, right? So in that sense, there's a lot of learning that I would say has happened from engaging with both businesses and standard setters. I know that you were more talking about gifts and payments, but I do think that there's some real value in these interactions that at least I would say maybe they have at times clouded my judgments. It's always hard to sort of say that, and we're not immune to these things, but I would definitely say that we need to sort of move probably along many margins. There is no perfect solution here, and I'm more of a glasses half full guy that says let's keep working on this problem, and that brings me kind of to Luigi's point, which is where I think, first of all, awareness is really important. Doing more in this area. The journals have started. So for instance, the journal that I'm one of the editors of, we've created a code-sharing policy because the issue became with commercial data, you often can't share. The authors cannot share the data. In the journal, in the econ journals, about half the papers get exemptions from the data policies because they can't share the data, right? But the code will help people, everybody has access to the data, then people can run the code on that data. So that's a step. In preparation for this panel here, thinking about this, I realized that we probably need to do way more on the data policies. Think about the Uber problem and these things. And there, I would say the issue arises not just with companies, but it also arises with respect to governments. Sort of when do they give data out and make that available? And that's sort of something that I think we need to continue to work on it. But Luigi, where you were sort of going very far in saying, once you give access to the researcher, they should be able to go wherever they want to go. I can see how that is also maybe too extreme a solution, because imagine, we as academics are often good at understanding things at a high level, but we're often not very good in the details, right? So you could imagine that somebody puts together a study that really doesn't make sense if you really understood what was going on in this company, puts that study together because it is sensational or because it has sort of like a really surprising result, and then the company basically has to put that out. And we need to figure out exactly how we then have a market that allows to say, well, that was a crazy result, but here's a sensible result. And how can we make that happen? So in my mind, this is, again, something that we need to carefully think about.
Isn't the market for journals and referees exactly that market?
To some extent it is, but how many, if you give access to this one person, right, and there is not like 15 others that also have the same data access that are all going to write papers on this, and then we're going to put these papers side by side and can say, these papers make sense. Or when you then get, as a journal, say you get one of these papers, are you going to say, now we need to find 3 other people that go to Uber, do the same analysis, and then see whether that same analysis shakes out or makes more sense? So I don't think it's that easy. But I'm in favor of, I'm a big, I'm an accountant, so I love transparency and data access. So we should try this, but I'm just saying I think there's sort of other sides of the coin here as well.
Luigi, in this paper, did they raise at least the issue of reckless driving? Right.
Well, in the interest of time, this could go on, and hopefully, like I'm not going to say my therapist says self-reflection should feel uncomfortable. It's okay. You got to breathe through it. Thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to see you at lunch. And
Thank you, Jim.
no problem. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you.